What happens when one of Hollywood's most respected voices sits down for what should be a friendly interview, only to find himself blindsided by a host spiraling out of control? In just 29 seconds, a single dismissive comment would shatter the facade of daytime television civility and expose the shocking truth about who was really calling the shots. Morgan Freeman walked onto the set that afternoon expecting a conversation. He had done thousands of interviews over his decades-long career, sitting across from journalists, hosts, and talk show personalities of every kind. This was supposed to be simple. Tamron Hall's show had reached out weeks earlier, pitching a segment about his latest projects and his thoughts on the current state of cinema. Standard stuff, the kind of conversation Freeman could navigate in his sleep. But from the moment he settled into the guest chair, something felt off. The studio lights were harsh, more aggressive than usual. The audience applause felt mechanical, almost forced, and Tamron Hall herself had an energy that Freeman couldn't quite place. There was an edge to her smile, a tightness in her posture that suggested this wasn't going to be the easygoing chat he had anticipated. The interview started normally enough. Hall welcomed Freeman with the expected enthusiasm, rattling off his impressive credentials and filmography. Freeman smiled politely, nodding along, waiting for the actual questions to begin. But then Hall leaned forward, and the tone shifted. "So, Morgan," she began, her voice taking on a sharpness that seemed to slice through the pleasantries. "Let's talk about relevance. Do you ever worry that your time has passed? That younger audiences don't really care about the kind of movies you make anymore?" Freeman's expression didn't change, but those watching closely could see the slight narrowing of his eyes. It was a loaded question, the kind designed to provoke rather than illuminate. He had dealt with provocative interviewers before, though, and he knew how to handle it. "I think good storytelling is timeless," Freeman replied, his voice calm and measured. "Audiences of all ages respond to authentic characters and meaningful narratives. That hasn't changed." It was a graceful deflection, the kind of answer that should have moved the conversation forward. But Hall wasn't interested in moving forward. She was interested in pushing. "But that's not really answering the question, is it?" Hall pressed, a strange satisfaction creeping into her tone. "I mean, when was the last time you had a real hit? Something that people actually talked about? Something that mattered?" The audience shifted uncomfortably. This wasn't playful banter or tough but fair journalism. This was something else entirely. Something that felt personal. Freeman maintained his composure, though his jaw tightened slightly. "I've been fortunate to work on many projects that have resonated with people," he said. "I don't measure success solely by box office numbers or social media trends. I measure it by the quality of the work and the stories we're able to tell." "How convenient," Hall shot back, and there was no mistaking the condescension now. "How convenient that you get to define success on your own terms when the actual metrics don't support your narrative." Freeman blinked. Once. Twice. He had been in this business long enough to recognize what was happening. This wasn't an interview. This was an ambush. And for reasons he couldn't fathom, Tamron Hall had decided to use her platform to tear him down. "I'm not sure I understand the hostility," Freeman said, his voice still steady, but with an unmistakable firmness underneath. "Did I do something to offend you?" Hall laughed. Actually laughed. It was a sharp, brittle sound that echoed through the studio. "Offend me? Morgan, this isn't about offense. This is about honesty. This is about having a real conversation instead of the usual promotional nonsense, where we all pretend that everything is wonderful and everyone is brilliant." "There's a difference between honesty and disrespect," Freeman countered. "Oh, here we go," Hall said, rolling her eyes dramatically. "The sensitivity, the fragility. You can't handle someone asking you tough questions." "Tough questions are fine," Freeman replied, "but what you're doing isn't journalism. It's performance. And it's beneath both of us. The audience was completely silent now. Even the production crew had stopped moving. Everyone could feel the tension radiating from the stage, the sense that something was about to break. Hall's expression hardened. You know what your problem is, Morgan. You're used to everyone treating you like royalty. You're used to walking into rooms and having people bow down to your supposed wisdom and gravitas. But this is my show, my stage, and I don't bow down to anyone. Freeman sat back in his chair, studying Hall with an intensity that would have made most people uncomfortable. I've never asked anyone to bow down to me, he said quietly. I've only ever asked for basic respect, the same respect I give to others. Respect is earned, Hall snapped, and lately, I'm not sure what you've done to earn it. That was the line, the moment where professional disagreement crossed into something uglier. Freeman's face remained impassive, but those who knew him could see the decision forming behind his eyes. Let me ask you something, Freeman said, his voice taking on a different quality now. Not angry exactly, but absolutely resolute. Why did you invite me here? What was the actual purpose of this interview? Hall seemed taken aback by the question. To have a conversation, she said, but her voice lacked conviction. No, Freeman said firmly. That's not why. You invited me here so you could try to humiliate me, so you could show your audience that you're willing to take down a, quote, Hollywood legend. You thought it would make you look fearless, authentic, but all it's done is reveal your own insecurity. The color drained from Hall's face. She had not expected him to flip the dynamic so completely, to turn her own tactics back on her. How dare you, she hissed. You come on my show, and you have the audacity to psychoanalyze me? You've spent the last 10 minutes psychoanalyzing my career and my relevance, Freeman replied. I'm simply returning the favor. Hall stood up abruptly, her microphone pack nearly pulling loose from her belt. You know what? I don't have to sit here and take this. This is my show. You're absolutely right, Freeman said, rising from his own chair with a deliberate slowness. It is your show, which is why I'm leaving. Sit down, Hall commanded, her voice rising. We're not done here. Freeman paused, turning to face her fully. Actually, we are. I came here in good faith, expecting a professional conversation. What I got instead was a display of ego and hostility that serves no one. Not your audience, not your show, and certainly not the principles of respectful discourse. If you walk off this stage, Hall said, her voice shaking now with either rage or panic or both, you'll prove everything I said about you. You'll prove that you can't handle real questions, that you're just another entitled celebrity who expects special treatment. Freeman smiled, but it was a sad smile, a smile of disappointment rather than anger. If that's the story you need to tell yourself, Tamron, then go ahead. But we both know the truth. We both know what happened here today. He turned toward the exit, his movements unhurried and dignified. Hall called after him, her voice growing more shrill with each word. This is unbelievable. You're really going to walk out? You're really that petty? Freeman stopped one more time, looking back over his shoulder. I'm not petty, he said simply. I'm just done being disrespected. Hall's face contorted with fury. Fine, leave. But don't think for 1 second that you can control this narrative. I have the platform. I have the audience. I will make sure everyone knows exactly what kind of person you are. And what kind of person is that? Freeman asked, genuinely curious. Hall seemed to struggle for words. Her earlier confidence completely evaporated. You're someone who can't handle criticism. Someone who thinks they're above everyone else. Someone who... She trailed off, apparently unable to complete the thought. Freeman waited a moment, giving her the chance to finish. When she didn't, he nodded slowly. I hope you find whatever it is you're looking for, he said, and then he walked. The studio descended into chaos. Producers rushed onto the stage, trying to figure out how to salvage the situation. Audience members pulled out their phones, already typing furiously. Hall stood frozen, watching Freeman's retreating figure, her face a mixture of shock and something that might have been regret. But Freeman didn't look back again. He walked through the backstage area with the same calm dignity he had maintained throughout the entire ordeal. Staff members pressed themselves against the walls, unsure of what to say or do. Freeman nodded at them politely as he passed, as if nothing unusual had happened at all. When he reached his dressing room, he gathered his belongings methodically. His assistant appeared in the doorway, wide-eyed and breathless. "Mr. Freeman, what just happened out there?" Freeman looked at her and gave a small, rueful smile. "I think we just witnessed what happens when someone confuses cruelty with courage. Should we make a statement? Contact your publicist?" "No," Freeman said, slinging his bag over his shoulder. "Let the interview speak for itself. People will see what they need to see." Back on the stage, Hall had finally regained some composure, though her hands were still shaking. She turned to face the audience, attempting to reassert control. "Well," she said, her voice not quite steady, "I guess we've all learned something today about how some people react when they're confronted with uncomfortable truths." But the audience wasn't buying it. The looks on their faces ranged from confusion to disapproval to outright disgust. They had watched the entire exchange unfold, had seen with their own eyes who had been antagonistic and who had simply tried to maintain dignity in the face of unprovoked hostility. One woman in the third row stood up and walked out. Then another. Then a small group. Hall watched them go, her expression crumbling. "Wait!" she called out, desperation creeping into her voice. "You don't understand. I was trying to have a real conversation. I was trying to get past the usual celebrity nonsense, and..." But her words sounded hollow, even to her own ears. Because deep down, she knew the truth. She had let her own need to appear tough and uncompromising override her basic professionalism. She had confused aggression with authenticity. And in doing so, she had not only lost her guest, but had potentially damaged her own credibility beyond repair. A producer appeared at her elbow, whispering urgently, "We need to go to commercial. Now." Hall nodded numbly, and within seconds, the cameras had cut away. The studio lights dimmed slightly, and Hall sank back into her chair, suddenly looking very small and very alone. Meanwhile, Morgan Freeman had already left the building. He stood on the sidewalk outside the studio, waiting for his car, and took a deep breath of fresh air. The afternoon sun was warm on his face. The street noise was ordinary and grounding. His phone was already buzzing with calls and texts, but he ignored them for the moment. There would be time to deal with the fallout later. Right now, he just wanted to remember why he had walked away. It wasn't pride. It wasn't ego. It wasn't an inability to handle tough questions or criticism. It was simply a recognition that some conversations aren't worth having, that some battles aren't worth fighting, that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is refuse to participate in your own degradation. The car pulled up, and Freeman climbed into the back seat. As they pulled away from the curb, he allowed himself one glance back at the studio building. Somewhere inside, Tamron Hall was probably scrambling to control the narrative, to explain away what had happened, to paint herself as the wronged party. But Freeman had been in this business long enough to know how these things worked. The truth had a way of coming out. The footage would speak for itself. People would watch the interview and draw their own conclusions about who had behaved professionally and who had allowed their own issues to poison what should have been a simple conversation. He settled back into his seat, closing his eyes. His assistant, sitting beside him, hesitated before speaking. "Are you okay?" Freeman opened his eyes and smiled. A real smile this time, not the sad one from before. "I'm fine," he said. "Actually, I'm better than fine. I stood up for myself. I refused to be anyone's punching bag. That feels pretty good." What do you think will happen now? Honestly, Freeman shrugged. I have no idea. But whatever happens, I can live with it. Because I know I conducted myself with integrity. I can't control how others behave, but I can control how I respond. And today, I chose dignity. The car merged into traffic, carrying him away from the studio, away from the confrontation, away from the entire ugly situation. But even as the physical distance grew, Freeman knew that the impact of what had happened would ripple outward. Clips from the interview would be dissected and analyzed. Think pieces would be written. Social media would explode with hot takes and opinions. Some people would defend Hall, claiming she was just doing her job or trying to ask tough questions. Others would condemn her approach, recognizing it for what it was. But Freeman himself would remain largely silent. He wouldn't fight a media battle or try to win public opinion. He would simply continue to work, continue to create, continue to live his life with the same principles that had guided him for decades. Because at the end of the day, that was all any of us could do. Live according to our values. Stand up for ourselves when necessary. Refuse to compromise our dignity for anyone's entertainment. The confrontation on Tamron Hall's show would become a cautionary tale. Not about celebrity entitlement or media gotcha moments, but about the importance of treating people with basic respect. About the difference between asking challenging questions and engaging in calculated cruelty. About the courage it takes to walk away from a toxic situation, even when staying might be easier. Freeman's phone buzzed again. This time, he looked at it. Messages of support were already pouring in from colleagues, friends, and people he had worked with over the years. They had seen what happened. They understood. He typed out a simple response to one of his closest friends in the industry. I'm good. Thank you for checking in. Some things aren't worth the energy. And that was the truth of it. Some things simply weren't worth the energy. Not every slight needed to be addressed. Not every provocation needed to be answered. Sometimes the most powerful response was simply to remove yourself from the situation and let your actions, your dignity, and your track record speak for themselves. As the car drove through the city, Freeman found himself thinking about all the young actors and performers who would hear about what happened. He hoped they would take the right lesson from it. Not that you should avoid difficult conversations or shy away from criticism, but that you should never allow anyone to treat you as less than you are. That professional respect is not negotiable. That your dignity matters. The sun was starting to lower in the sky by the time they reached Freeman's home. He thanked his driver, grabbed his bag, and headed inside. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new conversations, new opportunities. But tonight, he would simply rest, secure in the knowledge that when tested, he had stayed true to himself. Back at the studio, the rest of Tamron Hall's show had been quietly canceled for the day. Staff members cleaned up the set in uncomfortable silence. Hall herself had retreated to her office, refusing to speak to anyone. The weight of what she had done was beginning to settle on her shoulders, heavy and undeniable. She had wanted to make a splash. She had wanted to show that she wasn't afraid to confront even the most respected figures in entertainment. But in her zeal to appear fearless, she had crossed a line. She had confused confrontation with conversation. She had mistaken hostility for honesty. And in doing so, she had given Morgan Freeman no choice but to do the one thing that would speak louder than any words: to simply walk away. The door to her office remained closed. Inside, Hall stared at her computer screen, already seeing the first headlines starting to appear online. She knew, with a sinking certainty, that this moment would define her in ways she had never intended. That her name would become associated not with fearless journalism or authentic conversation, but with the day she drove Morgan Freeman off her set. It was a lesson learned too late. A reminder that power without wisdom is just noise. that having a platform doesn't give you the right to abuse it. That respect, once lost, is incredibly difficult to regain. Morgan Freeman, meanwhile, was home. He poured himself a glass of water and stood by his window, looking out at the evening sky. The whole situation felt surreal in retrospect. The hostility had been so unexpected, so unnecessary, but he had handled it the only way he knew how, with honesty, with dignity, and, ultimately, with the wisdom to know when to disengage. His phone continued to buzz with messages and calls, but he would deal with those tomorrow. Tonight, he would simply be grateful for the quiet, for the peace of his own space, for the satisfaction of knowing that when it mattered most, he had not compromised who he was. The interview would go viral. The footage would be analyzed, frame by frame. People would debate and discuss what had happened for days, maybe weeks. But for Morgan Freeman, the story was already over. He had said his piece. He had drawn his line. He had walked away with his head high. And really, what more could anyone ask for? The confrontation had lasted less than 15 minutes from start to finish, but its impact would resonate far longer. It would become a teaching moment for journalism students about the line between tough questions and personal attacks. It would spark conversations about respect in media and the responsibility that comes with having a platform. It would remind people that dignity is not something that can be taken from you unless you allow it. Morgan Freeman had not allowed it. When faced with disrespect, he had chosen to remove himself rather than engage in a battle that diminished everyone involved. It was a simple choice, really, but in its simplicity lay profound wisdom. As the evening deepened into night, Freeman finally silenced his phone and settled into his favorite chair. He picked up a book he had been meaning to read and lost himself in its pages. The confrontation, the drama, the entire spectacle of the afternoon began to fade into memory. Because at the end of the day, that's all it was. A moment. One unpleasant moment in a long and distinguished career. One instance where someone had chosen hostility over hospitality, ego over empathy, performance over professionalism. But it was not his moment to own. It was not his burden to carry. He had responded with grace, and that was enough. The story of what happened on Tamron Hall's show that day would spread far and wide. But the real story, the one that mattered most, was simpler and more profound. When tested, Morgan Freeman had remained exactly who he had always been. Dignified, principled, unshakable. And that, perhaps, was the most powerful statement of all.